Welcome back to Eye for an Eye, the future of perspective, where we teach the world to measure the pressures of insecurity and fulfillment. And the following is another episode in our series exploring the physics of perspective, a way to better understand ourselves and the world by expanding the depth of brightness within our own points of view. So today, we're going to explore a story about Chuck, a popular guy. Chuck had an amazing childhood, a big family with all the potential in the world. Chuck was always the kind of man's man. He was hilarious, but what he was most known for was when Chuck would set his mind to something, he would stop at nothing to achieve it. And like most, Chuck was raised with empathy. His competitive nature gave him a fair dose of tunnel vision. But that mindset was what he was most proud of. It was the key to his success. He built himself a great career and a happy family, beautiful home with all the luxuries everyone wishes for. Chuck was on top of the world for years. But the strangest thing began to happen to Chuck. He increasingly felt less and less fulfilled as he aged, even though he had more than he could have ever dreamed of. But why? Chuck couldn't make sense of it. It was this sense of pressure he couldn't escape. What used to make him happy didn't make him feel as fulfilled as it used to. It made him feel worse. So by using depth of insight, we'll explore the physics of Chuck's internal pressure and measure the brightness within his perspective and spark his objective sense of imagination. The key to brightness is understanding why. Chuck was always a bright child, full of life. He was curious of the world around him, and he had such a creative imagination. He was one of the funniest kids you'd ever meet, and was always surrounded by his friends. Chuck had so many hobbies, he tried almost everything. He dominated in sports, and he also loved to nerd out to science fiction. Chuck excelled in school, which wasn't much of an option for him because he came from a long line of physicians. His dad, his dad's dad, and his dad's dad's dad were all doctors, as became his older brother and his older sister. Chuck felt the pressure his entire life to follow in the same footsteps, which he did willingly. It was always something he felt fortunate for because it made him and everyone else proud. They had the means to see the world. It gave them all a sense of purpose, of identity, a sense of security. And Chuck married the love of his life, Emma, which to this day he thanks his lucky stars for. Chuck and Emma were blessed to have two beautiful children, an amazing dog, and everything he could have ever wished for. They were the epitome of health, happiness, and success on the outside. No matter what Chuck did or how thankful he felt, he couldn't shake the negative pressures of his own internal sense of insecurity. As he got older, Chuck thought there was something wrong with him. He knew he should be happy, but it felt like there was something missing. He could feel the value of the things he worked for his whole life to achieve, and that used to matter more than anything to him and to everyone else, were just fading in his heart, and it felt awful. On the outside, Chuck appears on top of the world, because compared to others, he might seem so. But on the inside, Chuck feels like something's wrong. There's an imbalance, and unfortunately, he lacks the insight to make sense of it. So let's retrace Chuck's path of insecurity through the prism of perspective physics. Now, the key to understanding why is being both open-minded and vulnerable enough to face one's own growing sense of insecurity. It is the most difficult thing to do as a human being, because we've been taught strength is the opposite of vulnerability, when vulnerability is key to insight. So let's start with the pressures of Chuck's environment that shaped his mindset. He was born the youngest of three, which presents many obvious pressures. The family always treated him like the baby, so he always felt behind his siblings and family his whole childhood. His family's identity is rooted in their financial and social successes. Chuck never truly appreciated the pressures of financial strains. Spoiled, he only felt the pressure to make more and have more than others. And Chuck was always above average looking, which gave him an inflated sense of security and identity. But those bright looks have long faded, and his reflection only reminds him of how far he's fallen. Another thing that matters to Chuck is how popular he always was. He loved being able to influence others. He used to feel unstoppable. Chuck used to feel it, but he hasn't in decades. And that pressure of people looking up to him at such a young age led him to make more mistakes than anyone could ever remember. The pressures of attention, without ever understanding the true reason for it, meant Chuck's influence, that he was once proud of, that defined him, the moments he thought were hilarious and memorable were actually awful and destructive. And regardless of any mistakes Chuck ever made, there was always the means and pressure to continue his family's legacy, which got him into all the best programs, scholarships, and institutions. Simply the drive to not fall behind his siblings was just the right amount of pressure he needed to get through his teenage and early adult years, and despite all the missteps, he graduated and received his doctorate. In the family room of his parents' house, there are shelves full of gold medals and trophies, photos and keepsakes of the growing list of external accomplishments their family has achieved that highlight their need to beat others, a lifetime of shallow, subjective glory. But his greatest accomplishment, however, he felt, was marrying his wife Emma and becoming a father. It was at the top of his checklist, and that everyone he has ever known is valued more than anything. Because of that, it meant it earned him another level of respect from everyone. There were the best moments of his life, when he felt most on track, mostly because that's how other people saw him. And with that respect came a loyal circle of friends who gave him a comfort zone to distract him from the obvious, that his mindset, his entire life needed attention, consideration, and most of all, reevaluation. Another major detractor of Chuck's focus came in his financial pursuits. Desperate to feel more secure, he invested his inheritance, his time, and much of his energy in growing his net worth. He always said he did it for his family, but at his core, it was to feel good about himself. That one bright spot that kept Chuck's head above water was being a doctor, and the impact he has had on all the lives of the people he has treated. But what Chuck will never admit to is the poor care he gave at times when he was distracted or distanced, when he wasn't in the mood. And as Chuck got older, he became grounded in an ever smaller comfort zone, repeating the same fucking stories over and over. Each time it gets a little more exaggerated. Nobody wants to hear your stories anymore, Chuck. They're only valuable to you. The stories often generate from pressures of being a male, trying to live up to the most ridiculous image of manliness and coolness that will be seen as shameful in another decade as mindsets evolve to see the past generations for who they truly were. And race is so important, it's both part of his narrative and benefits. It would be insanely fucking subjective in your own best interest to say race isn't part of society's point of view. And if you're thinking this sounds like religious bullshit, Chuck and his entire family are religious, but perspective is the opposite of religion and any of that subjective nonsense. Jesus won't save Chuck, and the only judgment that he should have feared is that of his influences and his own. He's running out of things to be proud of and feel secure for. So when that is the case, Chuck does as most people who are crippled with insecurity do. They resort to valuing traditions, familiar comfort zone and identities created by others that give subjective mindsets a false sense of self-esteem and belonging, a value they could never achieve on their own. Chuck is starting to hate the world. It's looking different. His traditions are becoming rapidly less valuable and respected. Everything he grounded himself to is fading, and he's only getting older. But everything I've mentioned so far about Chuck's life is simply subjective values, pursuits that were only ever valuable to Chuck, the subject. They were all subjective objectives, self-centered. When I said that the key to Chuck's fulfillment were his vulnerabilities, well, the other piece he needs to rekindle is his sense of objective imagination. Those are the elements needed to trigger insightful self-discovery. The pressures of Chuck's environment grounded in his imagination for subjective purposes, not objective pursuits. There is no subjective value left to achieve other than turning his imagination inward and exploring his vulnerabilities. He needs to discover a deeper sense of consideration, to discover for himself that the mindset which was instilled in him by his environment at an early age should be reevaluated. The more Chuck was using his imagination to reflect and reevaluate his life, the more compassion he would begin to feel. Not for all the great things in his life, but compassion for others he used to think could never understand how he feels, outside of his small comfort zone. He would begin to develop his heightened sense of objective empathy. The more compassion he felt and consideration he discovered, his life would begin to flash before his eyes brighter than ever before. Reconsidering all his choices with a greater understanding of the pressures of his insecurities and vulnerabilities, Chuck would begin to realize that everything he buried to craft this identity was what has been holding him back. He would then succumb to this positive, healthy pressures of honesty and clarity, as it terrifies everyone from his older comfort zones that grounded him in their own insecurities. And if Chuck made the choice to reevaluate his mindset, he would discover his buried sense of value that gave meaning to life. And they have little to do with any of the subjective goals that his environment, his time and space pressured onto him and into his subconscious. And once he learns to reevaluate their objective and subjective values, they gain access to reprogram their core principles, their instincts, and reverse the direction, trajectory, and momentum of their mindset and sense of diminishing brightness. This is where the sincere security begins, where bright insight can be felt and fulfillment achieved. Chuck would begin to grow in ways he could never have imagined. He would feel the sun on his face in ways he never felt before, and Chuck would begin to appreciate every negative pressure that he needed to feel to relate to people on a deeper, insightful level. That is what Einstein tried to quantify as special relativity. A deeper level of bright insight that allows an open mind to relate to others outside of their subjective point of view. The feeling of fulfillment grows. Everyone who saw Chuck would notice a difference, a glow, a smile that spoke louder than all of his stories of his past shallow glories. All of a sudden, what seemed like a life full of pressure and chaos on a treadmill during an earthquake would become simple. Everything would start to make sense. All the fairy tales, movies, songs, artwork would make sense. It's all an expression of the physics of evolution. And that ultimately is what narrative is. It was never meant for entertainment. It was the expression of process, of brightness. Chuck needs to evolve, as does all of nature. Subjective dreams are only for the most insecure. And by not evolving his imagination, he grounded his best objective qualities to shallow subjective needs for selfish vanity.